Yeah, it's a really exciting topic. I mean, we've had a few events where we've talked about the sort of the quality. We did had a gathering a couple of weeks ago with Will Hutton, where he was talking
Mhm.
about the sad state of the national conversation. We had
Mm,
Yeah.
Mike Berners-Lee looking at the problem, and Lord Deben actually with looking at problem of getting to the truth to a discourse of truthfulness on the climate
hmm
emergency. And of course, the World Economic Forum has said misinformation is our biggest medium-term threat. And so just getting our media environment right and good for the future as well, fit for the future is just something we're really interested in. And so we're really grateful that you're joining us today.
Another Digital Fireside chat, MarketingKind. And today's subject is the news. All the news that's fit to discuss, if I can paraphrase the New York Times' famous mantra. Um, the news is a complicated beast these days. There is so much to try and unpick with this. Fortunately, we have got the best possible person to help us today, and that person is Lotte Jones. Lotte is Chief Commercial Officer of the News Movement. Can I get a show of hands in the room? Who is familiar with the News Movement? Not expect, yeah, Paul. I would slightly, but I'll sort of, I think, because I'd heard of it. Okay, I'm interested. The reason I'm interested is I think it reflects where we're at. We are at a transformational time with news. And Lottie, I'm going to throw to you in just a minute to introduce the news movement, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your journey, how you came to be at the news movement, and the story behind that. Just before I do that, for the benefit of everyone else in the room, we're going to try and do something a little bit different today, which is I know you guys are used to a fairly long extended chat and then having the opportunity to ask questions at the very end. Today, we're going to try and involve you a little bit more throughout at various points. But in order to do that effectively, I need to give you a heads up about how we're going to do it. So, what we're going to do after Lottie's introduced herself in the news movement, we're going to talk about three main topics because this is such a vast topic, we could go down a million rabbit holes. What we're going to talk about is, first of all, we're going to talk about the current news landscape. Where are we at? How did we get here? And what's this transition from this thing we call legacy media to the socially driven media of the future? Secondly, we're going to talk about a little bit more into the future. We're going to talk about impact, the impact that the news movement is seeking to have, and the impact in general that media should be having going forward if it's to play a useful role in society. And we can talk about some UK, US stuff, I think, in that as well. And then lastly, the bit that we want to devote the most time to is to talk about the funding of media and the news movement's commercial model. Because that is also something that's going to have to change in the future and is very much where Lotte can give us her expert insight. Lotte Jones, welcome to MarketingKind. How are you?
I'm very well from a very sunny but cold New York.
Well, thank you very much for joining. Yes, it is similarly chilly in the UK. Tell us, for those we did the show of hands. There's some people to educate in the room. Tell us about the news movement. Tell us about your role. How did you come to be there?
Yeah, sure. So news movement is social first news for Gen Z. Those are very much our roots. We started about 3 years ago, so still very new. And we were founded by Will Lewis, who's now CEO at the Washington Post out here, a Brit with a long legacy in the UK media as well, and Kamal Ahmed, who was then at the BBC. And we have two newsrooms staffed solely by Gen Z contributors across the US and the UK. For anyone that follows us, albeit on their social media platform of choice, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, you name it, you'll be familiar with a style which is relatively peer-to-peer. So young people talking to young people. And I think the best articulation I use is that traditional news with a newscaster telling you the state of affairs in the world starts on series 3, episode 3. It assumes a degree of prior knowledge. Whereas with young people taking their first steps to navigating the world, it's really important that we start our storytelling on series 1, episode 1. So, for instance, one of the first times we did it was around the invasion of Ukraine. Rather than assume that anyone knows anything about Ukraine, we started with, here's where it is on the map, and here's the history of the USSR. And it's a lot to fit into a 60-second video. And it needs a lot of preparation to feel in the vernacular of social media, which is spontaneous, it's rough, it's ready, and how we marry that with the precision, the rigor, the fact-checking of traditional news storytelling. And I think that marriage of the rigor and the creativity of social media is kind of a daily and constant tussle for our newsrooms. About a year after starting, we opened our doors to commercial clients, working with, which I know we'll come on to in a bit, but working with businesses and brands who want to tell their story on social. It's been an interesting journey to build the plane whilst flying it. But the reason we've set it up as we have is partly due to my background, which is predominantly in corporate and consumer communications. I started my own comms agency, spun out of an agency called Blue Rubicon when I was in my early 30s, which I subsequently sold to a corporate comms firm called Teneo, which some of you may be familiar with out here in the US. I then worked with Matthew Freud as a partner at Freud's for 3 years, working on their consumer and corporate portfolio before being introduced to Will, actually when he was in the UK, and him inviting me to join the US team out here in New York. So that's like a brief trot through my history, but my history has predominantly been on agency side. So as a result, our commercial operations set up really very like an agency, whilst we organically grow our following to be able to talk media partnerships with the kind of weight and numbers of followers and engagement that we've really needed.
Excellent. And for anybody who's not familiar, obviously the news movement has your core brand, but also some parts to it. What are those?
Yeah, so the news movement is our sort of both our parent brand and a feed. We also then subsequently in 21 bought the Recount, which is I would say left-leaning, but relatively non-partisan politics brand out here in the US. We don't report on UK politics. So if you don't follow that, do give it a follow, because it is predominantly real-time political reporting. And I think certainly, obviously, since the election, but even prior to that, that's been paramount, both a narrative one wants to tune in and out of in equal measure at times. But we run that with, again, a young, but not necessarily exclusively Gen Z newsroom. And we've had particular success on Snapchat and spinning out a lot of our journalists to actually be creators and commentators in their own right, which politics naturally lends itself to. We also started a fashion newsletter brand, those of you that are familiar with Substack and the popularity of that as a news media at the moment, called Capsule, which again is targeted at a younger demographic, but exclusively around lifestyle and fashion. And that's edited and authored by a journalist who sits actually in between editorial and commercial.
Excellent. You mentioned Substack there, and of course, I mean, that's one of the things about your model is that you have key partner relationships with a lot of the social platforms. And can you tell us a little bit more about that, how that sort of works for you?
Works for us and against us, actually.
Well,
it's very hard because obviously whilst what we do is very prescient, both in style and obviously in content, we're battling around the fact that we don't own the printing press. So social media platforms, as has been well reported, and everyone in this room I'm sure knows, the algorithm is incredibly capricious. It's both influenced by politics, policy, and like consumer habits. So we're constantly battling with things like words we can't use, right through to the fact that politics is, 1 week deprioritized in feed and 1 week reprioritized in feed. And, our need to have relationships with those platforms so that we can not necessarily even be one step ahead, but quite frankly, keep up, is really important. And I think it's when politics meets the running of social media that it starts to become a very fraught medium to operate within for fair and balanced news to be optimized in your feed. So that's why for us, yes, followers are really important. They're important for me to be able to talk a brand language when dealing with brands. However, it's engagement that keeps us optimized in feed. So actually building community of understanding, ensuring that we are, offering debate in comments and that people feel very much part of the community and inviting to contribute is from a survival point of view very important too.
Well, that seems a very significant point of unity that perhaps we on the market in the marketing community should understand, which is the future of news is very similar to the future of marketing. All the things that you've just mentioned there, I'm sure people are nodding their heads going, well, that's what I'm trying to do too. Whether they're agency people or client side marketers. But we have all of those same problems, which is, as you say, the problem of the algorithms, the problems of how do you grow, how do you, how are you earning media, how are you owning it, how are you trying to make sure that you can reach the community. All of those things are across the board. So I think that's a really interesting starting point for the challenges that we share. Should we talk about the landscape where we're at, because so much has changed in quite a rapid amount of time. For those who don't know, what's your take on where we sit at the beginning of 2025 in terms of the transition from legacy media and what that means to you and to this new form of socially driven media?
Yeah, I'll start probably with just two caveats. One, I was the only person in the founding team at the News Movement who didn't come from a traditional media background. So I'm going to start with what might feel to many of you quite a crude sort of explanation of how traditional media is set up, but I think it's helpful just to level set. And I suppose I come at it from the point of view that news organizations traditionally are set up in church and state. That never the twain shall meet, because if the journalists hear of commercial deals being made over here, there is a belief that their thought processes will be fettered by bias. It is our belief that journalists are able to distinguish and hold in their hands that in one part of the business a deal might be done, but it doesn't mean that your news reportage needs to be affected by it. And I think that vast separation has meant that there is often an opposition between church and state, that one part makes the money and they don't understand why these guys don't realize it. And these guys are holding power to account and they think we're just dirty capitalists. So there is this separation that has become really quite large within a lot of newsrooms where, for instance, you'll see in certain news outlets, particularly in the US, newsrooms will turn in on their own organization and start reporting on it. And it becomes quite a sort of introspective output as a result of it. Yep. So we are different in that we are trying to bring the two closer together. It's not necessarily to elicit bias, but it's to encourage our journalists to be well-rounded professionals in a world where business is done and you are still able to hold power to account whilst understanding how a business works. And I think particularly for young people starting to make their way in the world, that is not only an advantage, but it will be a key weapon for survival, because media relies pretty much on two ways of making money. One, subscriptions, that's the kind of newer way. And two, traditional advertising, be that on page or on web. Yep. And very little innovation, I'm not saying none, but very little innovation has come since. So there is slight arms race in media at the moment for the next subs. That people are dwindling in terms of their subscription. Variety of reasons, lots of us can pontificate on in this session, such as like news fatigue, people's mental health, not being able to take the rapidity with which news is reported now, right through to increased cynicism around misinformation, quite frankly.
Is one of the drivers of this. I mean, talking about those forms. I mean, obviously, one of the things that's probably the most recent change that has affected news is actually TV related, in as much as we've all been, a lot of us probably haven't necessarily read a print newspaper for quite some time now. But we're probably more at a point of transformation between our old habits of watching linear TV to watching to the whole nature of consuming media on demand, as we've all sort of started watching streaming services more often. So is that in itself something that you're having to sort of work with in terms of how you see sort of societal behavior changing, and that we no longer sit down to sort of get the news once a day at 6 o'clock? Is that the sort of stuff that's driving what you're doing?
Yes and no. I think it did. I think there was definitely a moment, where, for instance, you had 24-hour news reporting and it deprioritized the 6 and 10 p.m. tune in. But I think we're some way beyond that now.
Yeah.
I think the creation of, I think it's for smartphone essentially, so it's apps now. And you're quite right. Yes, print media has been in rapid decline for many years. So I don't think that's necessarily the surprise of it, but I do think it's how media needs to better behave as a consumer of my attention rather than meeting my desire for news. And that's why you see the New York Times buying Wordle, because that will bring you in, or why the New York Times makes more out of its cooking vertical than it does out of anything else in its portfolio. It's also why you see a lot of new media players like Tortoise, particularly in the UK, making the majority of their news on podcast. You'll also see certain outlets in the news in the UK, again, not naming names, trying to make that happen and not really navigating it in quite the way that it could be, sort of meeting audiences where they're at. And it's interesting to see the anatomy of these different businesses try to modernize and bring what is ostensibly still quite a traditional newsroom and a news machine with it. And I think that's where it starts getting a little bit more human interesty, because you start to see, certain brands turning up like a dad at a disco, frankly, and some doing it really well. New York Times being one of them, how they franchised into podcasting and even taken a vertical like their Modern Love series, which many of you may know, it's a great podcast, but then they sold the rights to Netflix. And Vanity Fair's another medium out here who's done a lot with HBO, turning their long reads into docuseries. And I think that creativity and inventiveness in the sector, whilst relatively, I wouldn't say nascent, but new, it starts to get quite interesting. And as I say, you start to see the conflation of lots of different media and marketing disciplines all come together.
I suppose we probably, the rest of the world who aren't on the inside of this, we probably noticed a lot of this happening when we saw journalists, people we know, people with a large public profile moving. So obviously there's a lot of people left the BBC in the UK. We've had quite a few people leave the BBC, for example, and now they're on podcasts of their own shows. So there's Emily Maitlis and John Sopel and doing news agents and all that sort of stuff. But I noticed myself, now as you said it, I thought to myself, do you know what? I have realised that I used to be a Newsnight watcher. I used to be 10:30. I wouldn't even necessarily watch the news, but 10:30 I'm watching Newsnight every night, and I haven't probably now for 18 months, because actually I am sitting there watching Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart whenever I like on YouTube, rather than sitting and watching Newsnight at 10 o'clock. So even us Gen Xers are are starting to move across in our habits.
Yeah.
So and obviously the thing is that's for those of us who are older. but as there is a big generational split here, because that's, the Gen Z audiences, that's as you said earlier on, that's their starting point. They're just coming into it from that point of view. What do you make? I mean, do you think is it in terms of just length of content, in terms of sort of either sort of hour-long sort of podcast shows versus that, where do you see the kind of the value in creating different lengths of media?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it totally depends on the platform. So there is a home for long form content. And it's worth saying that YouTube is kind of the unsung hero for us in that regard. It's not only the sort of, in inverted commas, best platform to monetize on, because it has YouTube Shorts and a lot more of a male skew to it. Which means that it's slightly more equal in terms of the gender splits as well as the age demographic, which is interesting to me. So for something like The Recount, for instance, which is a politics vertical on my Instagram, you'll see quite a lot of Capitol Hill excerpts, quite quick, very speedy. The emphasis is on getting the news out there. Whereas on our YouTube channel, we have regular shows where you'll get what you describe, that sort of deeper digestion of trends that are happening, and our commentary talking to one another in a podcast format. So just because a news story shows up on one platform one way doesn't mean we replicate it across them all. And I think that is where it starts to get quite interesting from a news creation point of view. You can still recreate that podcast spontaneity and, as I say, digestion of the news that we all, particularly as Brits, love. You talk about Newsnight and that sort of heritage of an opinion piece. I think you can mirror that depth on YouTube very effectively in a way that it simply doesn't lend itself to the user experience on a TikTok or an Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the same. I mean, one of our own members, Rory Sutherland, who to me is I am absolutely a consumer through YouTube, and Rory to me is a kind of hero of YouTube. He's everywhere, but also, and I'm not on TikTok. But I saw an article the other day that said Rory Sutherland TikTok sensation, and I was like, aha. So what I love is Rory Sutherland, at 20 minutes worth of a time, but he's also managing to, do that. So it just goes to show whether it's marketing, whether it's news, whether it's people like Rory who are crossing the lines between them. As you say, it's absolutely possible to sort of take people on that journey. And I suppose we do, because we can't explain everything in 60 seconds, can we?
Exactly. And I think that's why a lot of our younger journalists work with very experienced editors in our newsroom to make sure that we are not assuming any prior knowledge, and that story really filters out in a journalistic way. Even if it's not presented like that, the words all make sense. So yes, exactly as you say, that's important. And not, as I mentioned about that analogy between series 3, episode 3 versus series 1, episode 1, making sure that we're not making assumptions as well, because I think with social media, you can pop up in anyone's feed. The targeting is not as linear as it was with TV when you had event programming. And young people today have not grown up with a notion of event programming. When I mean that, I mean staying in on a Saturday night to watch the movie because it's showing on BBC One, or, even right through to Ant and Dec's Saturday Takeout. Like, there's just not that language. You can tune into what you want when you want. So that element of serendipity and spontaneity is such an important currency to have threaded through our creative execution.
Indeed. Without asking you to be too wildly speculative, Lottie, you mentioned tortoise media earlier on. Now, from a commercial point of view, obviously, one thing that's been in the commercial sector of news is tortoises' efforts to buy the Observer. So here we have the new media attempting to predate the old media. How far and how fast should we expect that to happen?
Again, it is pure speculation. I love what Altus Media do, and I think they have demonstrated really clearly to both the industry and consumers that they are rigorous in their journalism. They've also been incredibly transparent. So if ever, you guys are on your travels, I advise everyone to dial into one of their morning meetings. They allow people to come into their editorial decision making in a way that I find incredibly admirable. I don't know. I find the sort of speculation around purchasing. I mean, everyone saw it last year with the Telegraph. I think the speculation is as much the story as the actual act itself. And I think even if they don't buy it, even if it was never their intention to buy it, it is an excellent narrative to have in the public discourse, because what it is challenging is people's perceptions of new media's potential and traditional media needing to get its skates on to modernize. So if all this does is serve to open people's eyes and help the scales come down from traditional media to think, crikey, we need to do something because this is coming to get us, it has served a really useful purpose. Whether it happens or not, I'm actually probably a little bit more culturally ruthless. I don't see it as a sort of death of a title that, in the same way when Woolworths disappeared from the high street, we all cried about pick and mix. Like I think progress is necessary. And if this serves to preserve a brand that a lot of people have loved in their homes for many years, then it can't be a bad thing.
Excellent. At that point, should we open up? Let's see what the community think. What are you thinking?
Quick question. I follow the news movement on Instagram primarily, and I think you guys have done a great job of getting that balance right between clickbait and having some depth. And it's so hard to do. And I often find you'll cover the same story, have a similar headline even to another story that will have no substance whatsoever. And in yours, although they're very short, they manage to educate. How do you find that right mix of drawing people in quickly and yet giving them something that is worth reading?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually, it's one I constantly fall foul of. I get it particularly actually on Facebook, where I'll see an article and I'll get sucked in. Like I can be there for a good 5 minutes trying to find the point, just out of sheer determination. I think Instagram particularly lends itself to much more quick news absorption. I also think there is some truth in that we, communicate to the audience through the audience that we're talking to and with. And it means that, morning meetings are really creative. So when someone comes in and says, actually, I do want to write a story about, I don't know, the Grammys, red carpets, they're not laughed out of town by an editor, and actually they're nurtured to bring that to bear in a way that feels real for them. And I think the constant question that I overhear in the newsroom is, would you read it? And you're right, it's a very careful balance to strike. And I think part of that is being very light around the incentive that we put on a newsroom to get followers. That actually, if it was just a question of getting bums on seats, likes and comments, then, there are some pretty, as we all know, crude levers that you can pull to do that. But if that's the only race we were playing, well, first of all, we'd be 10 times bigger than we were. But you start to sacrifice quality, with incredible rates. And we have a very, as I referenced, a very senior editorial oversight whose job it is to preserve the journalistic standards of a traditional newsroom, albeit in the face of a medium that is different.
Do you know what? The Grammys is a very good example, given that what we had this week was a question of, probably for newsrooms, of do we cover what happened at the Grammys or the stunt pulled outside by people who weren't even invited? What's the real story?
Good point. Yes, indeed. And the fallout for that. And I think that's actually a really good example where I think, and we haven't necessarily touched on this yet, but I think there is a perception that Gen Z first of all, they're an incredibly sort of multifarious audience with lots of different sort of conflicting beliefs and desires. But there is this view that because we do news for Gen Z, we are just reporting on celeb stories. And the reality is, our angle on that stunt, the Kanye stunt, will have been slightly more coming at it from a man-female relational point of view, rather than simply breathing fire into the kind of sensational nature of it. And I think that thoughtfulness is something that a lot of people struggle to tap into with Gen Z, that actually it doesn't all have to be frivolous to be fun and engaging.
You've got measures about how many people follow and the rest of it. Do you have sort of underlying measures if people are more likely to vote, more likely to engage in society because they're following you?
Yeah, good question. So on the first one, obviously, we've got the recount in the US, but as you rightly say, we haven't got a political brand in the UK. We do cover politics actually on both sides of the Atlantic from the news movement feed as well. We won't wantonly cover politics, so it does have to feel relevant. And 9 times out of 10, there needs to be a sort of link to real life. So it won't simply be this happened in the House of Commons today. It will be this has happened and this is why it's relevant to you. So I would say yes, it's politics with a small p. In terms of what you say there about the sort of link between if our followers follow us, will they be more likely to engage society? No. However, it's a very sort of current question in my head, because we haven't yet launched it, but between us, we're creating something called the movement metric, which is our own algorithm that speaks to the effectiveness of a piece. So it takes into consideration 7 actually different categories, one of which is like eyeballs, level of engagement, how many feeds did it hit, and all the kind of traditional marketing metrics. Plus, was there a call to action and how did people activate upon it? And has this cut through, for instance, to public consciousness, e.g. has this been talked about elsewhere? And those slightly more qualitative, softer metrics that traditionally as marketers we'd call like they'd fall into qual or like gut feel. So, it's the holy grail that we would love. And we're able to do a little bit of it through opinion polling, but frankly, I think as we all know, we can get those to tell us whatever we need. So the movement metric becomes a slightly more impartial, almost like an algorithm that we use both to motivate the newsroom, but also to motivate the brand conversations that we're having as well.
Do you have any concern or opinion on the control of the social media that is going on in the US? Because we are finding that a lot of people now distrust, social media and won't even like, post, or follow for fear of being put on a list or tracked by the government. So, I mean, it's kind of extreme in just a short period of time, but it's just something that I was curious if you're planning for or have seen, or, it's just something, like I said, we never thought we would be talking about necessarily in a freedom of speech country, but it is like that now.
Yeah, again, really good question, and something that we definitely have been very aware of. Certainly, I think, as you say, it's been such a short space of time, but in the lead up to the discussion around the TikTok ban, but then I think the alignment of Zuck and the power that be to Trump has precipitated a slightly deeper thread of concern around how this all plays out. I suppose I'd answer this question actually in quite a short way, and again, we can get onto this later if indeed you want to, but there will always be curiosity and people wanting to find information. Whether they want it at the volume or in the method that they're currently being delivered, we cannot say and we do not know. Have we noticed huge amounts of drop-off? Not yet. Do we see attrition in the future? Probably. Will these people go away, or will they go take their discussion somewhere else? I'm thinking places like Reddit, Discord, places that are emerging that feel safer and slightly more, dare I say it, sort of non-partisan? Maybe. And our job is to flex and take our, unique brand of storytelling to where audiences are. So said in short, had TikTok got banned, where would people go? And that would be our job to flex into.
Well, that sets us up very nicely to talk about the future, and the impact that the news movement is seeking to have as it grows. And hopefully, if we can also ask you, Lotte, about the wider picture of impact. What should news be doing to us and for us? And how is that changing as the world just becomes ever more kind of cognitively stressful? And I think it's probably fair to say, whatever generation we're probably finding our consumption of the news something that just becomes harder to deal with. So, what is the right thing to do?
What, in terms of a person, in overwhelm?
Well, I suppose it just in terms of, you were talking about earlier on about, for example, take the Ukraine example of not just diving in at series 3, episode 3.
Got it.
So because one of the things that's interesting is people, and we in marketing will know this very well. We tend to jump in with things like 10 things you need to know about. I mean, we've all done it. We've all written that line of copy at some point in time. Whereas actually the question is, do you need to know 10 things at all? Or would 3 do? And is that sort of thinking part of the impact you're hoping to have, is in terms of actually, curating the sheer amount of information that we need to know?
Yeah, and I think being guided by the audience as well, because I think one of the real assets, I mean, I sound like I've been a bit negative about social platforms, so I don't mean to be, because one of the great assets about it is that you get very real-time feedback from what's working and what's not. And I think for a newsroom, that's where it starts to get really interesting. And I'll give you an example. The Pellico case in France was a fascinating example whereby obviously there is a huge debate to be happening around that. However, it's very hard to get to that place of debate until you've given people the facts of the case. And we actually did a series of posts unpacking the facts, unpacking both the sort of details of what happened versus the course of justice that went on throughout those 2 weeks. And then that led us to a place where we sort of earned permission to be able to invite opinion about it and views in and ways into it, again, without being conclusive. And I think when you think about that in old world terms, what you're talking about is the front of the book where you get your headlines and your news and you read it really quickly on a newsstand, right through to continued on page 3, where you flick and you read the deeper explanation, right through to the op-eds, which of course British media has a huge tradition of, and commentariat that potentially might be dominated by a personality, not just impartial reportage. And I think that's a good example of a very, serious and earnest debate that needed to happen, but can't happen until you equip people with the facts. But then equally, there'll be moments, sort of Bianca Sensori being one of them, takes down a dress in real life. I want to see it. And then 2 days later, as the media cycle goes on, we start to dull our outrage, and actually we invite a slightly more cerebral conversation in, and that might be through a different medium. And I think that sort of permission that social media has to elongate and kind of, invite an intellectual journey, I think that for me is quite exciting.
Well, that is very, very interesting. That concept of permission. You've put a thought in my head there that interests me, because I mean, you remind me of the old was it G.K. Chesterton quote? The weakness of journalism is made up entirely of exceptions. And which leads us to, some of the old media mantras, the old, if it bleeds, it leads, kind of approach, which And that almost seems to me to be part of the problem is that worked all right, when the amount of bleeding and leading was relatively spread out such that we could cognitively cope with it. Whereas
Mm.
now, when my phone is pinging those sorts of notifications at me 18 times a day, I
Mhm.
can't cope with it like I could when I sat down at 9 o'clock at night, having coped with my day and gone, okay, now I'm ready. Now I'm ready for whatever's been, dreadful things have been going on in the world. So is that idea of that permission and the need to change, these things feel very, very linked.
Yes, and also I think I'd add to that the definition of what's news has changed a lot. So for the purposes of this conversation thus far, we've talked about world events, what I would call current affairs. However, there are a lot of other different definitions of news, particularly for this generation. So, for instance, most traditional news titles will have, beats and or verticals that they'll cover. And one of our verticals, to give you an illustration, is around sex and relationships. It's actually not around transport or whatever, or education, the traditional desks that you imagine, make up a newsroom. Obviously, because that just doesn't feel native to social media nor our audience's interests. So something like sex and relationships allows us to tap into debates like Bonnie Blue, or it allows us to talk about smear tests and how women need to do them once a year. And actually probably, is as much about growing up with our audience and going on those journeys with them than it is, as you say, panicking people into a state of overwhelm or feeling like we need to exhaust our audience with information. And I think those sort of verticals where you can get a bit creative and invite in, as I say, a bit of human curiosity and touch people in their daily lives rather than just in their intellect. I think that's when it gets exciting as well.
One of the interesting phrases that your brand has taught me in researching for today was the concept of people being news adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was a kind of lovely way of putting it, that actually we are more kind of, sometimes we're keeping a little bit of a distance, but actually if we approach it in that way and saying, we know you are not perhaps directly interested in what we the editorial team think you need to know, but how can we bring it to you? So is there anything more about that concept of news adjacent you can tell us about? So I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, I suppose there's an assumption that because you're engaged with the news, you need to know everything about it. And actually, as I gave the example with the Pelico, or actually a better example would even be some of the digestion we've done around the Bonnie Blue phenomenon. For those of you that don't know, it's OnlyFans, particularly women, competing to sleep with the most amount of men in a certain time period. And Bonnie Blue was the first to do it. And it's set off a raft of others, kind of, I say competing, but essentially replicating. And I think we have really successfully, through interviews and using the sort of lines of questioning from our own Gen Z newsroom, explored the notion of feminism in a way that doesn't feel judgmental, and allows people to put themselves in the shoes of the men, the women, the arch feminist, the person who thinks anything goes, and you can kind of explore it from multiple viewpoints. That means really you're speaking to people's mindset rather than their curiosity or appetite for news. I don't know if that sounds a bit high-minded, but for me, when I hear the word news adjacent, it essentially means that we'll find a route in through your
Well,
own.
that feels a lot nicer than what everybody gets in a tizzy with the BBC about, which is a kind of equivalence or false equivalence that they feel they have to do. It feels like you've got a more grown-up way of getting to that.
Thank you. I think it's also a reflection of, and by the way, I do not want to take credit for it. Our editors on both sides of the pond tirelessly work to do this and make sure it happens. And And I very much don't want to speak on their behalf, but I think what is an interesting sort of overlay to all of this is that it would be very hard to do if we weren't conceived of as a brand for social media. And I think if we had been conceived of as a podcast outlet, for instance, it could have easily gone a different route. So yeah, as I say, in an effort to be positive about the social media platforms, what it kind of forces variety on it, whether you like it or not.
Mm. I mean, there's another, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about politicians, but I feel I have to go there. Given how politicians seem to have perhaps learned a lot about some of the less ideal tricks of the media, such that they now employ those tricks themselves. We seem to have this weird thing where rather than politicians placing the media, it's the other way round. And
Yes.
they're dead catting this or that or the other, or to use I hate to excuse my language, but I will use the term because it is a genuine term, shit posting, which politicians will absolutely do now. Again, it feels like, the media now are the grown-ups in the room and the politicians are more childish. Is that fair? Is that fair to put that on the news industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I'd probably add another community to that beyond politicians, and that's celebrities and old world Hollywood. And there is some sort of parity between the power plays that go on between journalism and Hollywood versus journalism and politics traditionally. And I'll come on to a good example of that in a second. But I think, look, there is a huge virtue in politicians, to use my earlier phrase, owning the printing press. And the same goes for those of you that have worked in sort of corporate reputation or brand. You no longer have to kind of earn your way into media. You can just go out and say it, and we haven't talked a lot about LinkedIn, but that increasingly becoming a huge channel for individuals wanting to grow their profile. And what started as perhaps a blog, then became a podcast, then became, screw it, I'll just shove a tweet out. And I think Trump was the great, master of that in the early days of his Twitter use back in the day with his first administration. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's when it falls into the wrong hands that it becomes an abuse of power rather than a useful tool in bringing people on a journey of understanding with you. And the example I'm going to sort of just bring us onto is the Justin Baldoni case with Blake Lively at the moment. I don't know how many of you are following it, but it's a great example of brokerage that would usually happen behind the scenes in old Hollywood. And I actually saw an excellent post by Bethany Frankel. Those of you that don't know her, made her name on the Real Housewives of New York and subsequently became an iconic businesswoman over here in the US and is one of the few female billionaires. Anyway, she has an incredibly candid Instagram feed, and she gave the great example of how actually these are old Hollywood players failing to play by the new rules. So what's happening is they're taking lawsuits out against each other, and their lawyers are just broadcasting what's happening in real time on social media. So people feel beaten over the head by what is happening on a microscopic level, right through to a 60-page dossier being produced on a microsite by one of the legal team. And it's this absolute collision of old world brokerage and kind of reputational threats, and one party trying to bring down the reputation of another party, and then it's floated into a game of sexism and how actually Blake Lively's been subordinated by, and all the machinations are being played out to such a degree in the public consciousness that it's almost as tiring as some political narratives that are starting to come out. And I think when it comes to slightly, dare I say it, dated or archaic systems that are failing to keep up, politics is definitely one. I would say Hollywood is another. And I think that those are two sort of territories that can be quite tiring in that regard.
And the US election brought that into very sharp focus
Yeah.
as everybody seemed to listen to Joe Rogan and nobody was very interested in what Bruce Springsteen or Beyonce had to say about it.
Indeed. I don't know that it's everyone listens to Joe Rogan, but he speaks to a core of voters that were missed in this election. And I don't think that's really up for debate.
And as you said, also Joe Rogan is someone who his natural output can be used in both 60-second and 2-hour formats, which the others
Indeed.
cannot.
And to go back to the question earlier about the difference between sort of, headline grabbing and clickbait, I think he is a great master at it.
I want to move on to this question of the funding of media, the news movement's commercial model, because I know you're doing some very interesting things in this way. So do you want to tell us, I mean, first of all, tell us a little bit about how the news movement is, what revenue streams you have and how that's affecting your whole approach to news.
Yeah. We've danced around on this because we are 3 years old and we didn't open our commercial doors until 1 year of operation because obviously we needed a certain audience base to be able to play with. And as I say, it's partly due to the expertise that we have in the team and partly due to, I suppose, the nature of the changing media industry. But we have set the commercial team up much like a traditional, I would say, comms prior to marketing agency. We started working with brands like Accenture in the wake of the pandemic, where internal comms was really important. How do we get the CEO, Julie Sweet, to communicate in a way that felt on point and in the vernacular for what was an incredibly young workforce in some areas, across 750,000 employees. As time went on, people started going back to the office. Internal comms didn't come quite with the premium it once did. And our audience grew, which earned us a permission to have different conversations with different clients. So we provide white label digital services for a number of brands, including the world's largest retailer across UK feeds. We both create content in-house and put it up. I say put it up because we decide what goes where on which platform and how it needs to show up. Some of that might be simple things, jumping on memes, right through to quite complicated tax issues around corporate reputation and how you would communicate that to a younger audience. And I love the variety of that. As I say, that would be white label service. And then we do media partnerships. And we've recently really grown chops in that area because, of course, our follower numbers are now at around, we have around 100 million views a month, and our follower numbers continue to grow. And it's worth saying that although I joined News Movement as CMO, we have put very limited marketing spend behind growing our followers and engagement. And I deliberately say that because everything pretty much to date, hand on heart, has been organic. Given that we're a startup, we took that decision early doors. I think as we go into this next phase of growth, that will change as we start to create more notoriety and grow our brand. But media partnerships essentially will look like we've partnered with ASICS, the trainer brand, right through to TELUS, the largest mobile phone company in Canada, to tell their some corporate reputation stories. So ASICS did a big event for World Mental Health Day, and we would join forces with a creator to tell that story on our feeds and theirs. So as I say, it's taken us a while to get to the engagement figures where that becomes a worthwhile exercise for a brand. But I think the gates are very much open in that regard. And because so many businesses and brands are looking to talk to Gen Z, we've started to really see an influx of inquiries right through to small scale working with PR or marketing agencies to be part of their media laydown or to do a specific activation. So we charge per post, right through to, as I say, much larger executions across a period of time.
Is that inevitable? I suppose, I mean, obviously, influencer marketing is not new, but influencer marketing, as that has matured and splintered, it's probably getting harder to procure. So is there a certain amount of this we're going, you know, if you own an audience and you've curated that audience and you know and you've got data on that audience and you know more about them, because that's what an influencer probably is a bit more vibey about, let's be honest. They don't have the same forensic knowledge of audience data that you have, and therefore you can offer brands a great deal more reassurance about what is going to work for them and the ROI they're going to get than any influencer could ever give their client.
Yes, to a certain degree. I think maybe you do creators a little bit of a disservice, and that they are getting more sophisticated. But what you say is broadly right. I think as well you touch on an interesting point there, even with the word procurement. I think what we feel as an organization is that creators are often felt like a bit of a check writing exercise. We'll all remember what it was like doing a stunt with, a celebrity, and you'd sort of pay them and it would be a check writing exercise, and they turn up really resentful and you'd have to brief them on the morning, get them all excited about chocolate bars. I think that sort of model has then been transported to working with creators. So pretty much at the moment, they only have two ways of really making money, which will be endorsement and affiliate, right through to media partnerships, some of which can be really lucrative once you start getting to a certain amount of follower numbers. But for those people sort of teetering around 20 to 30,000 followers, which is, by I say, not a negligible amount, particularly if they are selling a passion and have a really vibrant, dedicated community, it's very hard to make money from doing it. And actually, it's a prelude to a product that we're going to be rolling out in the summer. And I can talk about it because we've talked about it. Thank you, Paul. Is called Who Knows? And it's a platform we're developing for news storytelling creators around themes such as sport, music, and current affairs and politics, to be able to put exclusive content on the platform that people can dial into using old language for a period of time that suits them. So you would log in and say, I've got 60 seconds or I've got 5 minutes, and it will serve you up thematic content on the basis that you need and want it. The advantage being that per view, creators will be paid, and it will be a direct to creator payment terms. So it's an extra artery of money making for them. The more content they put up, the more money they make.
Martin's already put a fairly key question into the chat. Tips on how we survive the media for the next 4 years. Martin, is there anything you want to add to that, or is that question self-asked?
I mean, itself to a certain extent. I think like the point being that like it's so attritional. The media has such a powerful all the media, like all the different streams and all the different strands of it, and it's just like constant. Like the other challenge being who's getting the voices on the media. So, there's lots of loud actors out there making lots of noise. And just tips on how to survive. We see it all with like Musk and his Doge group taking over various different federal buildings and whatnot and information, and it gets to like social security numbers and whatnot. So like,
yeah,
that gets to like a real depth of like my personal data or whomever's personal data, right? And that's like people get existentially like panicked about that type of stuff, versus then the Blake Lively type story, which is just this constant whatever the hell's going on there. So it's like, but it's all of those stories all of the time. How do we survive the media, like, and how it's doing what it is doing to us, I suppose.
Okay, Lotte, survival tips. What do you think?
It's a big question. It's a good one, but it's a big one. It's a shared responsibility. I think, only you know how much is too much. I think there are certain parts of the world where I think our sort of sensitivity to it either is kind of blunted or heightened, depending on who you are as a person. I think there are more, for me, I think the way that I think might become a way to better deal with it, because as you say, it's not now something that's happening over there, it's affecting daily lives, particularly, you know, for those of us living in the US, it has an immediate effect on so many things, right through to like the price of things, through to if you have friends from the LGBT community, like literally not seeing them represented in places that they were just a week ago. I think people will turn to action more. And I think you can populate your feed with places like the ACLU, which will give you very tangible ways to do something about it. And I think that is a change that we have seen from Gen Z. I think people's kind of tropes of them all being kind of activists and wanting to change the world is absolutely no bad thing, because in the current climate, we all have a duty to take an action on a personal basis.
Do we all need to just be better curators? Do we need to take more responsibility for our own curation?
I think there's some truth to that. I also think, you know, that's not to discount the fact that the world is not a very nice place at the moment. And, you know, it's very hard to hold a mirror up to that and feel perky about it. Whether that will shift and change over time and, you know, is in the hands of the course of politics to a certain extent. But I think there is some power that we can take back, and some, as you say, some autonomy of our experience that doesn't lay it all at the door of the algorithm or indeed the politicians putting the news out there.
I've spoken to a couple of your colleagues ahead of this session, and they mentioned some of the campaigning that you guys have done in the past, like the After Dark Alliance to support trying to keep nightclubs open and things like that. Are there any campaigns that you have actively going or planned for the future that brands could get involved with?
Yeah, good shout. We did a lot around nightclubs staying open. For those of you who remember in the UK, well, even still, I think it's still being reported on post-COVID. A lot of the big bastion clubs shut down, and it's had a huge impact on the fledgling music industry. So we represented that and talked to sort of clubbers and right through to producers. We don't have a campaign per se, but obviously the platform, Who Knows, that I mentioned earlier, will be aligned to helping creators grow and monetize. I think people wield around words like the creator economy, and yet nobody is really trying to tap into it in a way that's terribly inventive. So for me, I think that's where it starts to get really interesting, where actually don't just call it an economy, treat it like one. We have this huge like audience of people who are sitting there waiting to monetize. How can we work with them in a really sophisticated way that isn't just affiliate links and brand partnerships? And I think that's where it will start getting quite inventive, or that's at least my hope.
There are still some brilliant communities. I mean, there are new brilliant communities on the internet through whether they're, you know, web services or apps or everything. So I think we must, that's a good antidote to future horror, is let's go find some better communities. I mean, I'm on Letterboxd. I love Letterboxd to death. I'm a movie fan, and that's one of my, you know, my corners of the internet where, to be honest, there's nothing but good about it. Nothing but good about it. And so that, you know, it can be done.
Yeah. And places like, I think I touched on it earlier about Discord, that particularly is sort of, and Reddit, places where you can get into those sort of passionate loopholes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it becomes, it's that, it isn't the public town square. There's more niche than that.
Many of the people in our group are really passionate about business playing a role in tackling climate change. What have you guys found in terms of an approach that works with Gen Z in terms of educating, getting them engaged on issues around that?
Yeah, I think we have done quite a lot, actually. And I mentioned the TELUS partnership that we did in Canada. And a lot of that was around the impact on climate change, obviously as a mobile phone network, but also as a good actor in local communities. I don't profess to have any of the answers, but what I will say is when it comes to behavior change campaigning of any kind, albeit around climate change, politics, any of the themes that we've touched on, making it relevant to everyday lives is the most important thing. As I touched on with our politics reporting, you know, if we were to start and what happened at the House of Commons today, we wouldn't have any followers pretty much. But if we start with why the price of eggs so high, then you were able, you as I say, I use this phrase a lot, but you're earning permission to take people on a bit of a journey. And I think often in the sort of the frustration with inaction, the lofty nature of some of the scientific concepts that might sit behind climate change, or simply the fact that we've been talking about the same shit for a really long time and no one's doing anything, can really translate through to marketing activations. And I think the beauty of creators or working with young people to talk to young people is that they come with a totally fresh perspective. And if you listen hard enough, they will tell you what the right answer is and how to communicate effectively.
Indeed. I would just, quick question from me. There used to be, I suppose, journalists used to have sort of more individual profiles. And one of the things about social media is it often feels like, as with Hollywood actually, is, you know, the movie star era is over. Perhaps the kind of celebrity journalists, but actually, is that a thing that we do still need? I mean, on YouTube, there's a chap called, and he's on TikTok as well, Gary Stevenson. Young guy, ex-trader, economist, really, really cutting through to a Gen Z audience. You know, are people like him going to be important, do you think, in the future?
Yes, I think they're called finfluencers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There are a lot of them. And you know, they have a huge following and a huge responsibility. Particularly, I think, with a female lens, you get influencers like Mrs. Dow Jones, etc., or my rich BFF, who will give you hints and tips for saving in an IRA Roth, or, you know, my 401k and how to save for a pension. And they are probably at the coalface of helping young people. Frankly, I've learned a lot from them. Anyone navigate the world. And I think you're right. I think that's a huge sort of fertile area for sort of finance brands and actually lifestyle brands as well. Because I think if you don't follow Mr. Dow Jones or my rich BFF or lots of other people who follow in their wake, what they do very effectively is to kind of take very complicated financial topics and relate it to like dating or a topic that you do understand and have had experience of. And I think that level of creativity doesn't necessarily fall into like financial reporting that much. So yeah, I think any of those interest areas where people are working with it and playing with it in really creative, fun ways while staying quite true to the facts. I think that's where brands can start to play a really like interesting role in choosing and selecting sort of how they show up in feed, for sure. And it's not all
we could probably do a bit more of that on LinkedIn as well, couldn't we?
Yeah. Well, LinkedIn is, I think it's, for me, it's one of the most exciting platforms. I love what they're doing at the moment. They've done some hilarious they've supported some hilarious brand play. They've got one at the moment with Severance. I don't know if anyone's watching that on Apple TV, but the company in Severance has its own LinkedIn page and apparently is now in one of the top 10 companies on LinkedIn as of this week.
Okay.
How much of that is helped by the LinkedIn marketing department or not, I don't know. But I kind of love those little quirky vignettes that show how what is ostensibly quite a boring business brand is starting to put its head above the parapet.
Okay, interesting. I hadn't seen that one, so that's a good tip. We'll go check that one out.
When a brand comes to you with a brief, whether they want to work with you just for one post or a much more extensive project, do you ever have to turn them down if they're not a good fit?
This is such a good question because we have had many brands come to our door who do not feel, to use the words, like a good fit, i.e. they're not very, it might get just moved from, they're not very right on, they're not very on brand, right through to actually they're quite problematic. particularly from a Gen Z perspective. There are a lot of boycott campaigns out there for certain brands due to a myriad of considerations. Sorry, I've got building work next door. That's if you can hear the drilling. But we have set up an editorial and commercial board, including some of the younger journalists and or members of the commercial team, who will sit round a table and literally debate the fors and against in order to reach a broad consensus and agreement. We've done this on a case-by-case basis because we're small enough, and so far we have not turned down any brands, but we have definitely altered the brief to make it more suitable. I think there are very few brands that we would turn down. Bad brands do good things, good brands do bad things, and I think it's very rarely a linear decision. So for us, it's about getting in a room.
Well, again, that feels like a more grown-up attitude than many would display. So thank you. We are very close to time now, and Lotte, I know you've got a hard stop. So a huge thank you from us to you for your time. You've opened our eyes to a very complex picture and helped simplify quite a number of things that we can go and investigate. Is there anything that you would like us to do in terms of following the news movement from here on?
Well, I think you've just said it. I think if everyone gives this a follow, that would be great. And I know you were planning to share details after this. And if anyone has any questions or wants to get in touch or indeed talk about any of the challenges that they're wrestling with any brands they're working with, then give us a shout.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you.
Anna, just to close us out in the last 2 minutes, what's the housekeeping and internal comms for our future MarketingKind next events?
Yes. Well, just a reminder, I will connect everyone up on LinkedIn tomorrow morning so that you can put your questions directly to Lotte and her colleagues. And then coming up, we have on the 18th of February is our next Coffee with a Cause with Curating, which is, I won't even say the acronym, what it stands for, but basically they run a research station in Costa Rica, which is doing amazing biodiversity research and learning, and we'll be helping them with their growth strategy. And then on March 6th, we'll have our next exchange, which will be with Wim Vermeulen and Catherine Archer, sorry, will be hosting, who's on this call, and we'll be looking at the future of marketing. So that will be quite exciting.
Awesome.
And
we're also going to do a follow-up session with Apt Health, aren't we? Which I'm trying to do some work on at the moment. So that also.
Yes, definitely. And saving the NHS. So
yeah.
Thank you, Tom, for leading this session. Thank you so much, Lotte. I think we've all learned a huge amount.